Hi, everybody. I am Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Welcome to the first Dr. Class Tuesday webinar of the spring semester. As we've done over the last 2 years, we'll be doing a combination of in-person speakers and Zoom panels like today. All the sessions, though, will be hybrid in the sense that all of the sessions will have an in-person component with free food if you get here early enough. And all the sessions will have an online component as well. Before we start, I want to thank Marcela for her awesome work in making the Tuesday seminar happen. I also want to introduce and welcome my two wonderful co-hosts, Professors Alicia Holland to my right, Professor Francis Agopi to my left. We have a great lineup this semester, including a really, really exciting panel next week on the Milei Revolution in Argentina, which will include one of the intellectual architects of the Milei Revolution, Federico Sturzenegger. You can find the whole schedule for the semester on the Dr. Pass website.
Let me agree it wasn't a revolution.
Yeah, it's not a revolution, the Milei experiment. Sorry about that. Well, I'll go back and correct that. Awesome. I'm not going to discuss it.
I'll answer the question.
I'm not going to discuss it. Today's panel is on Chile's constitutional train wreck. Back in 2019, 2020, it seemed certain, absolutely certain, that Chile would undergo a constitutional reform. In October 2020, as all of you know, 78% of the electorate voted in favor of a new constitution. But 2 years later, as you also know, Chileans overwhelmingly rejected a draft constitution drawn up by a left-leaning constituent assembly. And then last year, Chileans rejected a second draft constitution, this one drawn up by a right-leaning constituent assembly. It is extremely rare, it is extraordinarily rare historically for any constitution drawn up by a democratic elected convention to be voted down in a plebiscite. And never before in history has it happened twice in a row like just occurred in Chile. So the question of this panel is how we explain this constitutional train wreck. Did Chileans not want a new constitution after all? Did they change their mind? Or did constitution writers from both sides of the political spectrum simply blow it twice? To offer some insights into this question, we've invited three extraordinary Chilean panelists. We'll introduce them, all three of them, before we let them go at it. In alphabetical order, Claudia Heiss is a professor in the Faculty of Government at the Universidad of Chile. She is former president of the Chilean Political Science Association. She's an expert on constitutionalism and constitutional change, and the author of a large corpus of both books and articles on this subject, including the 2020 book, Why We Need a New Constitution. Professor Heiss was a member of the Technical Commission for the Constituent Process in 2019 and head of public hearings at the Secretariat of Public Participation in the 2023 Constituent Process. So she was very much in the room in both processes. Secondly, Patricio Navia is a clinical professor of liberal studies and adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, NYU. He's also a professor of political science at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. Professor Navia holds a PhD in politics from NYU. He's published very widely on issues of democratization and democratic and electoral institutions in Latin America. He also writes quite a bit on contemporary Chilean politics. He writes columns for El Libero in Chile, Buenos Aires Herald, and Infolatam.com. And I think if I've got it right, 4 of his books have been bestsellers in Chile. Third, Marcela Ríos Tobar is the director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA. She previously and recently served as Minister of Justice and Human Rights in the government of Gabriel Boric. Dr. Ríos holds a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's a prominent scholar, practitioner, and activist in the promotion of women's rights and democracy. She's author, among other things, of Un Nuevo Silencio Feminista, La Transformación de un Movimiento Social en el Chile Post-Dictadura. Dr. Ríos served for more than 15 years at the UN Development Program in Chile, and she's taught at multiple universities, including Universidad de Chile, Universidad Diego Portales, and Universidad de Santiago. Welcome to all three of you. It is really a great pleasure and honor for us to have all three of you taking the time to spend with us. Just a few housekeeping items before we jump in. Actually, just two. We are recording today's webinar, and it's going to be available via the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after the session today. And secondly, importantly, if you have questions for our panelists, whether, I guess if you're online, you've got questions for the panelists, send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentations. We've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 12 minutes. That should leave us with a good 35, 40 minutes for discussion and Q&A, and I will do my darndest to take questions both from the in-house audience and also from the online audience. We'll close at about 1:20 or 1:25, the latest, because I got to go teach. That said, our first speaker is Professor Claudia Heiss.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for this invitation. I want to start mentioning that in Chile, we're living right now a very difficult tragedy that affects the country. There's over 100 dead in the deadliest fires we've had, and in the deadliest national disaster since the earthquake of 2010. And this event that we are facing today, that has really touched on everybody here, has to do with global warming, has to do with the management of wood plantations, with urban planning, and with many other issues that were discussed, particularly during the first constitutional convention. So these debates that we've had in the last years are coming again and again through many issues in political life. So we've had this very broad discussion of constitutional issues that really touch on almost every aspect of political life and of public policy. And so all of these discussions come back and are coming back through things like this terrible tragedy that we're living today. I wanted also to thank Harvard University and particularly the Rockefeller Center, not just for this seminar, but for the permanent concern with the Chilean constitutional problem and with the process. We started the Academic Forum for the New Constitution back in 2020. It's been a very long way, and all these seminars that you have organized with Chilean and international scholars and practitioners, I think are a very valuable source for political for political science in general, but also for people who want to understand what's going on in Chile. So I'm very thankful for that, and also because you have helped made available all these discussions to an international audience. And I want to do three things in my remaining minutes. First, I would like to try to answer what you asked. I think among the three options that you mentioned, to me, the correct answer is that the drafters blew it twice. So I don't think that people didn't want it, and I don't think people changed their minds, really. I think that we were not able to build a capable political process that could channel what people really wanted. So I think it's a failure of collective action, and it's a failure of politics, what we've seen in Chile. And I'm going to talk more about this, but I also want to tell you ahead that in a second place, I want to talk about participation in these processes, because I was involved in the last process, in the participatory process, as you mentioned, as head of the public hearings. So I want to say a word about participation. And in the third place, I want to say something about what can we learn from all of this. So to go back to what happened, I think that it's important to address some of the arguments that are arising now, and I think to try to demystify these arguments in light of this double or perhaps triple failure, because we failed twice with two constitution-making elected bodies, but also with a previous attempt at constitutional change in the Bachelet process. So I think we really had three failed attempts at constitutional change that installed some very important discussions in Chilean politics. So one of the arguments that are arising now is that it was never really necessary to change the constitution, and that really people never wanted to change the constitution, and that the demand for constitutional change was only based on the illegitimacy of origin. So it was used by the left to say, Pinochet did this terrible constitution, and only this argument of illegitimacy of origins was sort of a manipulative argument to try to convince people to move forward into a leftist agenda, basically. So what this claim entails is that the demand was a demand from elites and not from the people, and that it was sold as a magic recipe for change with very self-interested purposes from the left. Also, it's been said that people didn't read the text. It's been very much criticized that people voted without really knowing the details about the text. So I think these kinds of arguments should be addressed. I think when people say that nobody ever really wanted to change the constitution, I strongly believe that's not true. I think the problem was not the illegitimacy of origins. Every constitution, or not every, but most constitutions have problems of illegitimacy of origin, like the American constitutions, for instance. But it's very, you could claim that it was, white men, slave owners, all of that. But I think the problem with the Chilean constitution was not only that it was drafted by Pinochet, but it was that it was used as an argument to impede certain public policy. And of course, that could have been overcome without a constitutional process like the one we began. There were books written beforehand saying that the constitution could be interpreted differently. The amendments could have passed in Congress. But why didn't that happen? Because the right didn't want, and the right used this constitution to impede change. So the reason for asking for constitutional change was not that it was not possible to do, to change the model or to change the relationship between the public and private in the provision of social rights. It was not that it could not be done otherwise. It was that the right didn't want to do it otherwise, and so they used the constitutional provisions, the constitutional court, the supramajoritarian quorums, etc., to maintain their position of privilege in the political sphere that was unduly earned. They didn't earn it through votes; they earned it through these constitutional impediments. So I think it's a very tricky argument to say that. And I think that the constitution was a real problem, and that was proven by the student movement that reclaimed a change in a law that was an organic constitutional law of education. It was shown in a social movement that was not super massive, but it was there. That was the attempt to change, to mark the vote. It's an organization that emerged in 2013, Marca C, Marca Tu Voto, to ask for to follow the Colombian example and to mark the votes to create the possibility for constitutional change or for constitutional replacement. Also, the fact that the presidential campaigns since 2013, at least all of the presidential campaigns addressed the constitutional problem. So it entered the political arena in all political sectors. Even Piñera, who didn't want to change the constitution, did say that the constitution needed modernizing and offered like 60 constitutional reforms, etc. So about the people not reading the text, I think that the problem was not the text itself, it was the lack of a general agreement. The idea that we would have a text that would unite us was never produced, except perhaps in the expert committee, which did reach political agreement among different political sectors, but then the Constitutional Council changed all of that and tilted it to the right, to the extreme right. So I think if the expert text would have been submitted to a referendum, it would probably have been approved because nobody was really against that agreement. I think this has to do with an influence of this polarizing moment we're living in politics everywhere, of the crisis of representation. Perhaps a few years later, if we had had this process before, maybe before the Republicans and before this collapse of the political party system, perhaps it would have succeeded. Perhaps it wouldn't have happened, or maybe the explanation that it didn't happen is precisely because this polarizing moment also helped bring over the outburst of 2019 that really led to this. So I think populism or the discredit of traditional politics has affected, on the one hand, helped trigger the process, but on the other hand, affected the capacity to really channel social demands and bring it to a successful result. So to the second point about participation, I think we saw in 2017 in the Bachelet process and in 2022 in the convention a very broad opening of the public sphere. And I think in the last process where I worked, we saw a contraction of the public sphere. And I think it's really interesting to study how political participation and the new minimum that has became common sense, that you need to have participatory mechanisms, you need to listen to the people, etc., and how it has worked through these three processes. So I think the failure of the third process has to do with disappointment and tiredness, perhaps a change of preferences, although I'm not very sure of that. I'm not really sure that preferences changed. I think, that, of course, the voluntary vote distorted the preferences. So the inclusion of the mandatory vote in the last part of the process is a very, very important part of this. And I think also there were problems of design that maybe we can talk more about. I'm almost out of time. But I think that it's very dangerous to seek to replace the macro level deliberative mechanisms, the deliberation that is diachronic, that is massive, that is done through the media, by micro face-to-face mini publics, etc., or by local decisions of those that are publicly affected. And I think we saw in the last process the problems of direct participation, the problems of this hope to replace politics by the primacy of common sense or individual depoliticized interest. And so I think it's important to defend the indirectness of the public sphere. And I'm thinking of Cristina Lafont's work on the public sphere. And just to finish, because I'm out of time, I want to recommend you an issue, a special issue that we just published in PS, Political Science and Politics. It was an edited volume of that we worked on with Julieta Suarez from the Catholic University. And we invited more senior scholars and also junior scholars to reflect on what we can learn about this process. It's a symposium on the Chilean constitution making process that addresses the issues of indigenous participation, gender parity, the problem of the lack of tune between the constituent body and the public outside of it, the role of independence. So many of the issues that led to the failure of the 2022 convention are there with really interesting. It's 6 articles, very short, because the short pieces of the symposium are it's shorter than a regular article. And then we have a final chapter where we analyze what we can learn from this experience. So I think that's all I'm gonna say. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Our second panelist is Patricio Navia.
Hi, everyone. I have a presentation to share with some data, and then I will try to use my 12 minutes wisely. So just to start out, Chile is like a friend I have who wants to move to a new house and keeps on telling everybody that he wants to live in a new house. And every time somebody shows him a new house, he still chooses the old house. So he does want to have a new house, but not a house in this world. So wanting a new constitution is different than wanting a new constitution that you can actually draft. But all this goes back to the social upheaval. My main point, and this has been true for the past 4.5 years, I've argued that the social upheaval was about material goods. People were unhappy with pensions, with a number of policy issues, very, very important policy issues. but the response by the political elite was to offer them a new constitution as a magic pill that would solve all of the policy issue problems. I mean, including climate change, right? So a new constitution is going to just take care of all the things that elsewhere in the world are discussed as policy issues. And as sort of a short summary of what happened in 2019, President Piñera, rather than changing some of the policy issues that he cared most about, he decided to surrender the constitution and say, well, don't kick me out of office, rather write a new constitution so that I can stay in office. That's kind of what happened in 2019. I do need to recall, though, that, I mean, in terms of policy preferences, Chileans have voted for alternation in power since 2009. So they haven't really been happy with the governments they have had, and they have voted for the opposition. So it's not altogether clear that in terms of policy, Chileans are always sure that they want to move left or right. What we have seen over the past couple of decades is that every 4 years, they choose to move away from where they were, and they choose vote for an opposition government. That has been true in Chile since 2009. In addition, there are issues. I mean, the processes do matter. Those of us who study institutions do know that processes matter. I think part of the problem, and I think to some extent, Claudia made this point right before, is that people confuse constitutional issues with policy platforms. They discuss the rules of the game with preferences in terms of how pensions are going to be assigned, or how taxes and distribution and other issues are going to be decided. And policy issues should be left to the political process. I mean, you cannot enshrine in a constitution policy preferences. You certainly can, but it's not a good idea to do so, because it actually takes power away from people every 4 years when they go to the polls. I mean, if the policy preferences in a country are going to be enshrined in a constitution, then why vote if you are not going to be able to impact the direction on which the country moves? So I think part of the problem of the failure of the constitution writing process is that we ended up confusing policy platforms with a constitution in Chile, and the first and second failed constitutions ended up being really policy platforms that reflected either left-wing views, as in the first constitutional proposal, and right-wing views, as in the second constitutional proposal. Now, there are a number of issues. Another issue that I do want to address is sort of this idea that we live in a crisis of representation. I mean, it's been 30 years since Mainwaring wrote that paper. Democracy, crises do not last for 30 years. Maybe this is how democracy works. And the benchmark to which we need to compare democracy cannot be Robert Dahl's ideal democracy, but how democracy has worked in the past. And in my view, the whole notion that the country is sort of in a continuous permanent crisis doesn't really help to us to understand what things work and what things don't work, and what issues can be improved. So there were a number of badly designed issues with the first and second constitution writing process. There was an excessive overrepresentation of indigenous groups. Some members of indigenous communities got elected with less than 100 votes in non-competitive elections. The constitution writing process allowed for independents to run as party members, and that didn't really work out very well. So lots of things that we know should not be done were actually introduced in the constitution writing process, and that was a really bad idea. And that's the reason why the first body ended up producing a text that was way too far to the left, and the second body ended up producing a text that was to the right of the median voter. We have long maximalist constitutions. I mean, the first text included some really curious policy preferences, right? The Constitution said Chile has to favor international relations with Latin American countries over other countries. That's clearly a policy preference. It shouldn't be in the Constitution, but the Constitution sort of tried to enshrine many policy preferences into the text, and people ended up voting against that sort of maximalist text in the first and second case. I mean, the second constitutional draft created at least 8 new government agencies. And this was a far-right text written by people who allegedly want to shrink the state. They sort of put 8 new government agencies into the new text, which is something that I guess other right-wingers elsewhere in the world just wouldn't understand. Chileans wanted to fix the country. They didn't want a new country. And I think that the perception that the constitutions, particularly the first one, was going to create a new country, it's very important to understand why people voted against the first text. So I extend these arguments in an article I published in the Journal of Democracy in April last year, but you can read that one. But this figure, I think, says a lot about why the first constitutional draft was rejected. This is presidential approval in bars from March 2022 to September 2022. This is weekly presidential approval numbers. And you can see that the approval intention for the constitutional draft moved together with presidential approval for Gabriel Boric. So among second-order considerations, the fact that the Boric administration was unpopular also helped damage the chances of a constitution that was supported by the government in the plebiscite. So people rejected the constitution, at least in part, because they didn't like what the Boric administration was doing, and the Boric administration campaigned for the constitution, and people ended up punishing the Boric administration by voting against the constitution. This is another set of numbers that might be helpful. We tested for whether those people who voted in favor and against the Constitution, this is the first draft in 2022, we tested whether those people have democratic or authoritarian values. So people who favor having a military government majoritarily rejected the Constitution. This is this value here. 82% of them voted against the new Constitution. But there was only 8.8% of Chileans that favor having a military government. So yes, those with authoritarian values voted to reject the Constitution, but those who favored a democratic system were sort of tied in terms of approving and rejecting the Constitution. So this is not like people who supported Pinochet voted against the new Constitution, and those people who were against Pinochet voted for the new Constitution. Very few people claim to be in support of a military government. And in general, those people with democratic views were split in terms of whether they supported or rejected the new Constitution. In the first plebiscite, a majority of those in the left voted for the new Constitution, and a majority of those in the right voted against. But this is what's interesting. Those who identified as center voted more against than for, and those that identified as known also voted more against than for the new text. So this wasn't a left-right divide. The majority of those who do not identify or identify as centrist ended up voting against the first text. We also looked at economic vote perceptions, and not surprisingly, those that perceived the economy was doing worse voted to reject the text, and those that perceived that the sociotropic conditions were better voted to approve the text. So there were a number of second-order considerations also at play during the first plebiscite. And we also have some socio-demographic determinants. Now, I just want to spend a few minutes on why the second process failed. So after you spend 2 years telling people that the country doesn't need a new constitution, it's kind of difficult to sort of change gears and say, well, no, we're going to flip-flop here, and we're going to now say that the country does need a new constitution. So I think it was a difficult sell for right-wing parties to propose a new constitution. I do agree with Claudia in that in the second constitutional process, the text drafted by the experts would have probably passed. But then again, it would have been a text drafted by experts, not a text drafted by a democratically elected body. So the whole idea that we are better off with a constitution written by a democratically elected body doesn't really stand any kind of criticism when we sort of everybody agrees that a text drafted by experts turns out to be better than two texts drafted by democratically elected bodies. I think the evidence is pretty clear that Chileans are like my friend who wants to move to a new house but doesn't like any of the houses that are offered to them. We have two chances of replacing the Pinochet-era constitution, but people disagree on policy, and that's perfectly fine. We do have disagreements in policies, and that's why we have a democratic process that allows people to vote for a left-wing government or a right-wing government every 4 years. I think many people confuse and continue to confuse policy preferences and a policy platform with a constitution. And many people wrongly, I believe, want to enshrine in the constitution some policy preferences. Granted, in the case of Chile, right-wingers were able to enshrine in the 1980 constitution a number of policy preferences. But the solution to that is not to enshrine left-wing policy preferences in a constitution, but to erase from the constitution some clear policy preferences, and I'm afraid we did not do that in the constitution writing process in Chile. To end, I think the constitutional debate in Chile is not closed, but I think the process now will entail moving forward with constitutional reforms rather than with trying to write a whole new constitution. But I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Navia. Third speaker is Marcela Ríos.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor, a pleasure. I think that even though we've talked a lot about the Chilean process, we will probably continue to discuss the question for the seminar for decades to come. Not just in Chile, but constitutional theorists and scholars and practitioners. I think that the Chilean case opens, a basket full of questions, and I don't necessarily think that we're close to coming up with adequate answers. I think on the one hand, there is no single answer to the question posed for this conversation, in the sense of why did the attempt of replacing the constitution drafted during the dictatorship fail twice, as you mentioned at the beginning. For the first time in human history, a constitutional test is rejected twice in referendums. So I don't think there's a single answer. This is a complex, multidimensional problem that needs to be looked at in that way, from different perspectives. But I also wanted to say that there's been sort of a small industry of scholarship, analysis, papers that grew out of the first rejection, where a lot of hypotheses trying to explain why the first text had been rejected concentrated, in my perspective, extremely narrowly on the institutional dimension of the constitutional process itself, either by putting an emphasis on the content of the constitutional text offered to people or on the process, in the sense of who the people who drafted the text were, the presence of indigenous people. Patricio was mentioning the presence of independence, so this identity proliferation, a lot of the explanations would, and the papers written in the most prestigious journals have said that time and again, that the problem had to do, that Chileans did not want a radical left-wing text, that Chileans rejected sort of independent identity politics offered by the Constitutional Assembly, that people were, put off by the performance of the Constitutional Convention, that there was a perception that they, had concentrated on public policies, that they didn't have the expertise to draft a constitution, that they had been too radical, too maximalist. Most of the analysis of the first rejection really put a focus on the constitutional members themselves, not to mention the way that these people have been treated in Chilean society or the Chilean media. Most of the conventional members of the first round were, for all intent and purposes, converted into pariahs of Chilean society. They can't give an interview, they can't make an analysis, they can't say anything because they are the fundamental culprits of that failure. And I think in social sciences and in politics in general, we really seldomly or almost never have the possibility of measuring counterfactuals. So if you said it was the independence, indigenous, feminists, and the left-wing content of the Constitution, how could we prove that that was actually the case? But here we have, in a way, the complete, the counterfactual, the complete opposite from the first process. And I think, it is important for the analysis of the first convention to be critically revised. I don't think you can come up with explanations for the first process that are completely opposite to the rejections of the second process. So if it was because it was a left-wing text, now we're going to say, well, it was the fact that it was a right-wing text, or because there is alternation in preferences. This, as we all know, the political system jumped really quickly in designing a second process. To my opinion, without really analyzing deeply the explanations of why Chileans had rejected the first text. They had this, I think, caricature of the first convention, and in that way, they designed a second process that was completely opposite. Completely dominated by traditional parties, with an expert commission, minimizing the presence of indigenous people, excluding independence, social movements, etc. Using a completely different electoral design, so that representation was much more majoritarian than in the first round. So in most of the institutional design, you could say these were completely two different cases, but then the results were the same in a way. So I do think that we need to look at the explanations and with a critical eye, and understand that on my take, I think we need to concentrate on two separate sets of explanations. On the one hand, I do think that institutional dimensions and institutions matter, but not when you look at them in isolation from the rest of the political system. I think an over-concentration on looking at the convention and how it how it acted, how, you know, individuals connected and how they made decisions or the content of those decisions, fails to see the way that the institutional dimension of the convention of the constitutional process interacts with institutional dimensions of the political system in its entirety. And I think in that regard, two levels of variables that need to be looked at. First is the electoral calendar that sort of was continued to operate simultaneously within the constitutional processes, and which meant that we had a constant, non-stop campaign mode from the beginning to the end, parallel to the two processes. That really was detrimental to the capacity of political parties on either concentrating on the constitutional debate or having the willingness, the attitude, the incentives, and the context of, you know, debating broad kind of societal issues rather than public policy debates or, you know, discussions that were aimed at, you know, short-term gains. And the second has to do with electoral design, but with the institutional designs of both processes. But in this sense, I do think that what I see is that there was such a mistrust of political actors amongst political actors, and there was one sector, at least political sector, that really wanted to make the approval of a text difficult. That all sorts of mechanisms were introduced into the design to make that approval difficult. You know, the elevated quorums within the Constitution, really complex representational design, which was still not enough for approving the text, but you require, you know, direct democracy at the end, even though you had, you know, every sort of representative mechanism in the design. You impose this final referendum at the end, and then, as Claudia mentioned, the introduction of mandatory voting, that, and out of itself, it's just sort of a major kind of political revolution, bomb, transformation to the political system and the behavior of all the actors, including citizens. So, you know, an institutional design in general for both processes that made it really difficult to approve the text. And secondly, and most importantly, I would say, I think that the major causes for this outcome do not necessarily have to do with institutional design, even though I acknowledge that that was part of it. But I think it has to do more with the functioning of the political system and the relationship between the political system and society. You know, when you have a deteriorated system of representation, it is very difficult that political actors that do not have, you know, links to society can, you know, represent the interests of the society that they are not representing. You know, it's not like you, because you started a constitutional process, all of a sudden the, you know, crisis of political party system or the mistrust of institutions and the low levels of trust in politics that in a way trigger the social revolt change. You had the same political dynamics as, you know, societal relationships with politics during the constitutional process that you have in Chilean democracy or Latin American democracies more broadly right now at play. So you didn't sort of freeze politics to begin this process. You know, politics continue to work in the same manner. And in this respect, so I think there's two dimensions that made it difficult for this process to deliver the result of constitutional replacement. On the one part, as I said, is the crisis of representation, the fact that neither new actors nor traditional actors were able throughout this process to represent society, either sectors of society or society in general. They were incapable of constructing legitimacy and sufficient trust for either of these two processes. And the second, it has to do with the decay of the political party system, and which also continue to function the way it functions in Congress, in municipal governments, in politics in general. I think this is one of the most important takeaways for other countries in this process. Is when you begin a constitutional process, society or political actors are not, you don't bring political actors from the theoretical constitutional text of what political actors should be in a constitutional process. You act in a constitutional process with the political actors that you have. And the political actors that we have are fragmented, a very fragmented political party system, as I said, with few links to society, with a lot of polarized political system. That was, of course, the polarization exacerbated by the electoral calendar running alongside the constitutional processes permanently. So finally, I have 3 minutes and I want to stay within my time. Like I said, I do think that the main question, which is something that I don't think how we resolve, is the constitutional process. And I agree with Patricio in the sense that this was an elite offer to citizens to solve the social and political crisis provoked by the social upheaval. But in a way, how can politics offer an institutional solution when politics is so deteriorated? When regular democratic institutions have failed to be able to address fundamental social issues like pension reform, like health reform, like many other long-standing issues in Chilean society, how could they, just because they design a different institution, be able to come up with answers that they hadn't in other institutional settings? So I think that is a fundamental question for constitutional processes going forward, in the sense that we do not stop politics from working. Two other takeaways, I think, is that both processes, the first processes showed us, and I think I also agree with many of the analysis, is that you can't push a constitutional replacement when an important sector, and I would say all elites are against it. You cannot push a constitutional transformation with the entire, cultural, political, economic, all sorts of elites against the text. So you cannot approve a text, against all the entire sector of elites. But the second process shows that sitting traditional elites at the table and giving them the monopoly of decision-making doesn't assure the construction of legitimacy. Just because you have elites doesn't mean that you will have popular legitimacy. So we need, in other contexts, acknowledge that you need both things. You need the engagement of elites, but you also need to construct popular legitimacy. And finally, and I think this is very important for Chile in the sense that not because a constitutional text is rejected, new constitutional texts are rejected twice, doesn't mean that the constitution that you wanted to change to begin with now has broad legitimacy. The two failures doesn't add up to legitimacy for the text. And I do think that, as I said before, in other Latin American countries or in other countries around the world that are looking to construct new social contracts that prepare societies better for the challenges of the 21st century, including, global warming and all sorts of other things, that had looked at constitutional replacement as a fundamental or as a key form of building social contracts. After this Chilean experience, will probably think twice or three times about this route. And I do think that we have to think critically of what other options do we have for building new social contracts when constitutional replacement is so difficult. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ríos points to a pretty tough catch-22, which is that a high level of crisis of representation and fragmentation. Here, I think I dissent with what Patricio said, that there's no crisis of representation, but a severe level of crisis of representation and fragmentation may create the perception, correctly or not, of a need for a new constitution, but that very crisis of representation can make it impossible to reform the constitution. We'll now turn to questions. I want to start with Fran.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thank you to the participants. I've been looking forward to this panel for weeks now. I'm going to ask a very narrow empirical question and then embed it in my bigger question. The narrow empirical question is, what do we know about who voted for and against both constitutions? I love the metaphor of the friend who wants to buy a house and can't settle on one, but is it the case that it's the same people that are voting no to both processes? Or is it the case that Chile is, or some large segment, a large enough segment of the electorate to affect the outcome, is actually voting consistently, but reacting to different documents? So that's the narrow empirical question. The broader questions go like this. While I can agree that it's more complicated to write a constitution in a modern society than it was when 13 two-seater tables were set up in Philadelphia. If you've ever been to the room where the US Constitution was written, it's really quite dramatic. 13 little tables, a room this size. But, you know, I studied Brazil a lot, and here there was a very participatory process, a lot of citizen engagement, even though the members of the Constituent Assembly themselves were elected representatives, a very lengthy document that had lots of policy stipulations in it, including the length of paternity leaves.
Dangerous, right?
I remember friends, well-intentioned friends, like pulling their hair out saying, I can't believe what they're putting in the Constitution. And yet this document has held. There were some amendments in the first few years, but this document, do you want to say something? No. Okay. But this document has held, and what's different about Chile? So here my hypothesis is that this process might have gone more smoothly had this constitution, had a constitutional revision or new constitution been drafted in the 1990s or in the 2000s than today. Is Chile more polarized today than it was in 1996 or 2006 or even 2016? Is that possibly part of the problem here? Is that there's a deeper polarization of society? And while I can agree that policy should be debated in a Congress, if there's a constitutional limit on what it takes to get policy through, if there are more veto points or something, then the rules of the road themselves affects the policy debate. And so that's where here's my comment. But that's the question. Are they the same people voting now? Is Chile more polarized? Is that the explanation? If not, what is so different about Chile from other countries that have large, messy participatory processes that put in quirky clauses, articles in their constitutions, trying to recognize the role that social rights play in the 21st century?
In about 2 minutes each. Well, let's go in the same order just for simplicity. Claudia, and you don't necessarily have to answer each of you all the questions. Just pick and choose.
Just, I think Patricio will know more about the voting patterns, but I just wanted to say that the 56% who voted for Gabriel Boric is the same number of votes of the 38% that approved the new constitutional text. So in number of votes, this is why I said I'm not sure about this idea of changing preferences. Really, the people who supported Boric for president included people from the center. Obviously, it was not all Frente Amplio people. It was people from the Concertación who voted for Boric to prevent Cast from winning. But the number of votes is the same as the number of people who approve the constitution. So here the mandatory vote is the key, I think. And about the Brazilian, I agree. I think if we had a process like the Brazilian process at the beginning of the transition, we would have had a new democratic constitution. I'm sure. I think all of these problems arises from the fact that we did not have a constituent assembly with all the political parties in the beginning of the transition, or like the Spanish case, when political parties existed. I think the key difference is that we don't have political parties now, that we don't have representative political parties, parties that are capable to really build legitimacy or give the people the impression that all political perspectives are represented in the constitution-making body. And this is what I think somewhat achieved the expert commission. And I wanted to say something about what Patricio was saying. The expert commission was not really only, at least, an expert commission. It was a commission elected by Congress in the proportion of the parties in Congress, which represented political ideas. So I think it's more important the fact that that it was more tight, more probably representative of the political cleavages. It was more like political party representation in normal politics, or what we used to know as normal politics led by political parties, than what the fragmentation and this new the independence and all of that. So I think also in line with what Jorge Montesinos was asking in the chat, I think about what Patricio was saying about policy preferences and not putting policy preferences in the Constitution. The Constitution of 1980 has been intensely used for policy preferences, to prevent certain policy preferences to become law, even if they have majorities. And so I think I agree that the main drive of the constitution-making process was to deconstitutionalize some of these issues and bring policy preference back to regular politics and to majoritarian politics through Congress. And I agree that the convention went on to constitutionalize perhaps too much, often in a symbolic way rather than in a real, concrete way, leading to the law to laws that had to pass the regular political process to become real afterwards. So I think if this constitution had been approved, it would have been moderated by the following political process. But I think that the issue of policy preferences is at the root of the problem. So deconstitutionalizing policy preference was part of the right to change the constitution.
Thanks. Patricio.
Yes. So in terms of who voted for and against the two options, well, left-wing voters voted for the first one and against the second one. Right-wing voters voted against the first one and for the second one. But moderates and independents, for the most part, rejected both constitutions. Those were the pivotal voters. If you want to blame anybody, well, blame the constitutional conventions for not thinking about the median voter in the exit referendum. I mean, if you are going to, and this is the difference between the Chilean constitution and the Brazilian constitution. The Brazilian constitution was not voted in an exit referendum. They had a referendum, I think in '93, on whether they wanted a monarchical, presidential, or parliamentary system in Brazil, but not a referendum on the constitution itself. Normally, we don't have that many referendums on the constitution after the constitution is written. So that was kind of unique in the case of Chile. Normally we decide whether we want, or countries decide whether they want to write a constitution, and then they elect a body, and the document produced by that body it's adopted without an exit referendum. So that was somewhat unique in the case of Chile. I do want to take an issue, though, with the point about two issues here. One, with the point of policy preferences. Well, elections do matter. And the last time Chileans voted was in 2017, and they voted for a right-wing government that campaigned against writing a new constitution. So Chileans did vote in 2017, those who bothered to vote, I mean, it was optional voting, that they voted for a candidate who campaigned against writing a new constitution. So if we are going to respect the democratic process, imposing upon an electorate a constitution writing process after people voted for a candidate who campaigned against a new constitution, it's also sort of a questionable practice as to how democracy should be conducted. I understand majorities change, but those majorities should be expressed in a democratic process and not by burning churches or destroying public property. I mean, I understand political change happens that way, but it shouldn't be sort of the ideal way in which it happens. I also want to recall that in Chile, there was a constitutional referendum in 1989. 90% of those who voted for it. It was done at the end of the Pinochet dictatorship on a number of constitutional reforms. Claudia, Heiss, and I wrote a paper about that a few years back. So they did have a constitutional referendum, but it wasn't a new constitution. It was a set of reforms that the military dictatorship acquiesced to reform the 1980 constitution. And one final point, I disagree with the argument that Chile is more polarized today than it was before. I mean, the evidence just doesn't show that. The elites might be a bit more polarized, but Chileans are just not more polarized in the polls. We don't really have that much evidence of how polarized they were before, but Nancy Bermeo's book on polarization shows that they weren't really that polarized either in the 1970s. The elites are far more polarized. Now, I'm unsure as to whether any constitutional or new constitution would pass today, but we do know that constitutional reforms that tend to be longer are more likely to trigger more opposition. So a shorter document, it's easier to pass because a longer document will have more things that some people will oppose and will campaign against. In the most recent constitution, the main driver of opposition to the right-wing constitution that just got rejected in 2023 was the perception that this new constitution would restrict abortion rights. So the more things you put into the constitution, the more reasons some people might want to oppose that constitution. So strategically, it might be a bad idea to just keep on putting things into the constitution. And I do agree that the 1980 constitution had a number of policy preferences. So that's clearly the case. Many of those things were changed over the years. Some other things were not changed over the years, but for some reasons, some of those things are things that people favor. I mean, I might disagree with something, but the fact that I disagree with something doesn't mean that other people might not. And people kind of favor things that might not be a good idea, or other people might think it's a bad idea, like the private ownership of pension funds, which I think is one of the major issues that it's under debate in Chile today. Well, a majority of Chileans want two things. They want to keep private ownership over their pension funds, and they also want the state to give them better pensions. Those are sort of two contradictory things, but those are the things that people want. So if you push for a new constitution that will nationalize private pension funds, well, expect that a large number of people will oppose that.
Okay, Marcela.
I wanted to say something about the questions in the chat. Diego and David were asking about what's the appetite or the possibility of a new attempt. I don't think we're gonna embark on constitutional replacement anytime soon. One of the effects of this entire process, which is a very important, this was one of the authoritarian enclaves of Chilean democracy after the transition, is that the quorums to reform the 1980 constitution have been lowered significantly. So there might be issues. I think, for instance, there is interest in an important sector of political parties in Congress to discuss political reform, to confront political party fragmentation through a new system. So that might be tackled, and there might be other small, constitutional amendments. I don't think that the more sort of profound ideological inclination of the Constitution is going to be tackled anytime soon. But I do think that we're going to have a constitutional rest for probably quite some time. And I wanted to talk about the the question on elections, because I think both Claudia and I mentioned the mandatory voting, and I do want to maybe unpack that to answer the question of who voted against and in favor, because what happened until introduction of mandatory voting in the first plebiscite is that, and at least the work that we had been doing at UNDP, but many other people in Chile had been showing how abstentionism, we had half of the people voting consistently, and they were fundamentally the same type of people with more identification with party, with more interest in politics, who had been socialized during the transition. So older voters, people with stronger left or right wing preferences. So the half of the electorate votes really consistently left and right. But then we had another half, or 40% of the electorate, who had never voted in their lives. So I think it's kind of picky of saying that in 2017, you had certain preferences of Chilean society, when half of Chilean society never voted for left or right or anything. And what's happened is that the introduction of that 45% of the electorate into the political system has completely changed electoral dynamics, because you have a percentage of these people that do not have strong ideological preferences, and a sector. So it's not like I would also disagree with the idea of the medium voter. They're not the medium voter in the sort of classic American electoral literature, in the sense that these are people that are concentrated more in popular sectors, less levels of education, but also people who have a really attitudinal distrust of politics. So they might be inclined to vote for the left in one election, or for the right in another election, or for the center in another. It's not that they have ideological centrist positions. They're more kind of less, they have less strong ideological or political position. And that makes electoral dynamics very different from before. And I think it's going, and the fact, as Patricio was saying, that the constitutional processes require this referendum at the end, with mandatory voting, with an important sector of that electorate who was not ideologically inclined, politically interested, really made a significant change of what the outcome was. And I do agree with the premise that if this process, either of these processes, had taken place at the beginning of the 90s, we would have had a new constitution. And not because of polarization, and in that I also agree that it's not society that is polarized in Chile, but because you don't have political parties. Political parties have this label of political parties, but they're not really representative parties of society, first. Secondly, because we were already immersed in this distrust of politics. And third, something that we haven't mentioned, and this, the radical revolution of digitalization, artificial intelligence. Somebody mentioned this in the comments regarding the media and social media. This is the first constitutional process that occurs after, social media revolution. All the other constitutional processes had taken place, the last one in Tunisia in 2014-15, in Colombia in 1991. So all the other examples of constitutional replacement have taken place in radically different political context, not just in Latin America, but globally.
All right, guys, we're running out of time. I'm gonna try to do a cluster of questions, and let me just say the following. Fran is allowed to ask long questions because she's Fran. You guys aren't. When you guys build political science careers like Fran, then you can ask long questions, but we need to keep the questions short. So I'm gonna take 3 questions and then ask the panelists also to be a little more concise in their responses. So I had Laura and Fernando and Claudia.
So thank you so much. I have 3 quick questions. The first one is there such a thing as a constitution without policy? Right? Like institutions have winners and losers. What you put in the constitution gives advantages to some and not others. Is that a pipe dream, right? Mm-hmm. The second one is crises of representation have actually been quite successful in creating new constitutions. Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, to a certain extent, Colombia. What is the difference in Chile? And the last one is, what is the alternative, right? So we have discussed here that it's because the Chilean constitution had a referendum afterwards. I was thinking about how some of these constitutional processes in the past created a constitutional assembly that then took over Congress, right? Replaced Congress, and that kind of moved the politics out of this discussion, but it also took over Congress. And I don't know that we want that really. So what is the alternative? How do we create a process that creates a new pact between different groups in society that I think is clearly needed without resorting to these kind of maximalist strategies?
Great. Thank you. Piggybacking on what Laura said, every political process has winners and losers. Who's the winner of this political process? Because all I heard is about losers.
Interesting. Claudia.
Thank you, Steve. I'm sort of amazed by the statement that maybe in 1990s a constitutional process reform could have gone well, because in 1990s, Pinochet was being ousted of power, and the price that sort of Chilean society paid for having a pacific transition to democracy was ensuring Pinochet through fencing off the operation of the political system, of the partisan system, and of Congress, was the guarantee for that transition. So I'm not sure you can have both, a constitutional deep reform and a pacific transition ousting of power, Pinochet, first of all. And second of all, that's to some extent true, but as I understand, Ricardo Lagos was able to do a partial constitutional reform. What were the key sort of institutions in place ensuring the protection of Pinochet and rights in not only the constitution, but in laws and in the functioning of the partisan system that was actually important to change in order to sort of habilitate a more broad and representative process of policies? Because those were the key issues, if I am in the political process, those were the key issues that I would have, pointed to, identify and move forward with, rather than a total change of everything, because you're not going to change everything. And what matters is to change the institutions that was holding the right and the legacy of Pinochet on hold 10 years after.
Great. Why don't we go in reverse order, just to shake things up. So we'll start with Marcela, and then Patricio, and then Claudia. If you could keep it to 3 minutes max, we would be.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to answer everything, so keep it short. In terms of winners and losers, I would like to say everybody lost, but I don't think so. I think this is a win for the people who wanted to maintain the Constitution, that never wanted to change, and it's certainly a huge defeat for people who wanted to change it, particularly the left in Chile. It is certainly a defeat of the left and everyone who had been pushing for constitutional replacement. In terms of what's different from Chile and the other cases that Laura mentioned, I think that Chile, the crisis of representation is completely different. I think the only sort of more similar case that you compare is to Colombia, because in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela, you not only had a constitutional process, but you had a huge majoritarian political force that control the constitutional process and control the government and control, they had the majority everywhere. So you had a single political actor kind of pushing this reform with a majority of the actors. In the Bolivian case, you had a little bit of more compensated, but Ecuador and Venezuela and in Chile, you had a fragmented, diverse sectors. No coalition had a majority in Congress or in the constitutional processes. I think that makes a big difference in terms of how you can push for this process. And none of those processes had, of course, a final referendum, with the exception of Bolivia, but Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, none of them had a referendum, which also makes things quite different in terms of the dynamics for approving the text. When you don't have a referendum, you can have political accords within the institution, or political agreements among political actors. You don't have to go back to the sovereign for a final decision. That makes a huge difference, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. Patricio.
So I think, let me start with the question as who won and who lost. Clearly, those who want to keep the status quo won. So those advocates of market-friendly economic policies won twice with a majority of the votes. So that's significant. We might have pension reform in the future, which is I would argue what the main reason behind the riots in 2019 actually was. But that pension reform is going to be market-friendly because that's the kind of country that apparently Chileans want. I do agree that constitutions do have enshrined policy, but the longer the constitution, the more enshrined policy you have. So you should probably try to write a shorter constitution if you care about voters and care about people choosing which direction the country will take in the next few years. The more you enshrine things into the constitution, the more you limit the ability of people to decide what or which direction they want to take the country in. And finally, I do agree that the way forward is what Chile had actually done rather successfully since 1990, and that was to gradually reform the constitution. I mean, some people might want it to have done more things, but then the policy preferences among the population are not that clear. But most of the authoritarian enclaves were actually modified. The reforms Lagos implemented in 2005 were very, very significant reforms. So Chile was moving in the right direction. I think we'll continue moving forward with changing the constitution in a number of things. Some will be positive changes, other changes will not be positive changes. Depending on what people's preferences are, we're going to move left or right, but that's how democracy normally works. I think the big lesson Chile leaves for everyone is that institutions matter, and we should be careful at strengthening institutions in the absence of institutions, and perhaps that's what people refer to the crisis of democratic representation. But in the absence of institution, power is filled by other leaders, Nayib Bukele, Uribe, Chavez, and other leaders. I think it's much better to have boring and quiet presidents with strong institutions than very loud and powerful presidents who replace strong institutions. And I think in that sense, the rejection of both sort of constitutional drafts in Chile is it's a vote of support for stable, gradual, and consensual institutional change.
Thanks. Claudia, you have the last word.
Very briefly, with regard to what Laura was saying about whether there is a constitution without policy, of course, we've had a constitution with too much policy on it and anti-democratically preventing certain policies. So I think the basic thing is to have a constitution that allows different political sectors to govern. But the problem here, of course, the debate in the Constitutional Convention was whether gender and social rights, for instance, are human rights and should be entrenched in the Constitution. Some people saw these rights as policy preferences. And I think there's a debate about what is a policy preference. So can you have a right-wing government with sexual rights and with social rights, or is that a policy preference? So there's a deep debate about that. And I think the right in Chile presented all of this as policy preferences, and some people think these are not policy preferences but basic rights. About the crisis of representation and what's different in Chile, I think Marcela explained it very well. We didn't have a majority controlling the process as in Venezuela, which is good because you don't have, somebody that will, as we say here, pasa planadora, or can, pass over the entire political system. But it's bad because it's very difficult to build political proposals. We didn't have really negotiating capacity in the Constitutional Convention. Then we did in the second process, which also failed. But I think the lack of a majority and the fragmentation is the answer to that. About who's the winner of the political process, I think not only the status quo is the winner, but also a radicalization of a conservative reaction, a pushback in the expansion of rights that we've seen in late years, in recent years, that I think is very worrisome and that may feed the extreme right and the populist right that has grew in other countries. Was it possible to have a pacific transition with a new constitution? So I think that's not. I don't want to be unfair to the leaders of the transition to democracy. I understand that there was fear of the authoritarian regression and of the comeback of the armed forces, but I think you cannot say, based on comparative experience, that it was not possible to have a different kind of transition to democracy. We've had one of the most tight transitions to democracy, and that's the fact that really created all of this problem. We had Pinochet as commander-in-chief after the transition for many years, and then as senator in life. We didn't have the capacity to remove high commanders of the armed forces until 2005, many years after the transition to democracy in 1992. So I think there were other ways to do the transition to democracy for sure. And then about, to finish, I agree that there's not like a polarization in Chilean society, and polarization is more prevalent among elites. But I do think what we have is a deinstitutionalization of political preferences, very high electoral volatility, and I think that's the problem, the incapacity to build support for any kind of proposal. And I think that's what really brought to the failure of both constitutional proposals.
Thank you. So before closing, first of all, next week we have this great panel on the Milei disruptive, not necessarily revolution. Secondly, I just want to, and no disrespect at all to Patricio's opening metaphor, but I've got this friend who was buying a house and had this perfect house in mind. And the family had this idealized situation, and in a week they found that house. They found the very house. So it is possible. Finally, many thanks to Claudia Heiss, Patricio, Navia, Marcela, Ríos for a terrific presentation. We really appreciate your sharing your time and your insights. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Take care.